you say that we're anti-minority or anti-black.
No, I didn't say that. I asked. See?
Well, okay, fine. Fair.
Don't start any stuff
All
with
right,
me,
okay,
man.
all
Don't
right.
get me in trouble.
What's in the air? You know what's in the air. You know what's in the air. You know what's in the air. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so JD Vance is doing a little media tour right now to promote his dumb book. He's been on a couple programs like Fox the Five he was a guest on, and probably a few others in the coming days. And in this interview on the View, they really grilled him. They talked to him about Epstein, inflation, as well as his previous comments on Trump and immigration, etc. But here's the first part where they ask him about inflation and Trump's recent comments that he loves inflation. So you'll get a sense of the tone of this conversation watching JD Vance try to defend that.
President Trump has called affordability a hoax. He said that, not me. He's pouring money into this ballroom of his and the reflecting pool. Oh, don't forget the Arch de Trump, I call it. And a White House cage match. All these things. Why is he doing them when you just, everybody knows that Americans are struggling? What is he spending all this money for?
Well, I got to defend the president on the hoax point. What the president said is the idea that Republicans caused the affordability problem is a hoax. And I think that's true. If you go back to the Biden administration, inflation got up to 9% under the Biden administration, okay? Right now it's at 3.5%. By the way, too high. We're doing everything that we can to bring it back down to 2.5%, which is where most people would like to see it.
He just said he loves the inflation.
What he said, Anna, what he said is that he loves the fact that the inflation is going to come down when this war is over. That's what he said.
That's not what he said.
That wasn't a direct.
Are you his interpreter or are you his vice president?
All right, so this is pretty much the job of anybody around Trump, is to constantly defend and explain the stupid statements that he makes. He did say that the inflation will come down after the war. That doesn't really make sense that he said he loves it, though. Why is it a good thing to drive up the prices just to drive them down? The point is that this was not a policy ever aimed at reducing inflation, and most of Trump's policies aren't. At best, what you could say is that he views all of these different policies as leverage points that he can use to inflate the prices in the market, or maybe get a good buy-in on something, get a deal from a certain company that wants a policy to be implemented a certain way. But if we do get this actual deal, this Iran deal, then a lot of the right, including the people who have been upset about this Iran stuff, are going to go back to saying, well, you know, Trump brought the prices down and blah, blah, blah. Even this thing that JD Vance says about how, you know, inflation was so high during the Biden administration, that was at its peak, and it was already coming down during Biden's administration, which was the best that they could hope for during the Trump administration, was to continue that trend of inflation coming down. For a little bit they did, then soon as Trump's actual policies started kicking in, it fucked everything up, especially the Iran war. But in this next part, this is where they get into the Epstein stuff, and you see a little bit more of JD Vance's weaseling around on this. And, you know, there's a lie that he gets away with here that I really wish they had been able to better catch him on. But here's them on Epstein.
You know, one of the things you see in the Epstein emails is that Jeffrey Epstein hated Donald Trump, and that Donald Trump literally reported Jeffrey Epstein to the police.
Okay,
that's one of the things that came out of these files.
They were best friends for about a decade. And remember, he signed that Transparency Act under duress when some Republican women, congresswomen like Lauren Boebert, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, did not give in to his pressure of not signing. He brought Lauren Boebert into the Situation Room to pressure her into caving on not voting for that bill.
So let me respond to that. So
that's all true.
Let me respond to that. So number one is, yes, Donald Trump, and he said this, he knew Jeffrey Epstein back in the 1980s. He also threw Jeffrey Epstein out of his club when he found out he was a creep and reported him to the police. That's something that the media often misses when it reports this story. They tell the fact that they knew each other in the 80s, which the president himself admits. They ignore the fact that he narked on him to the police and led ultimately to JeffreyEpstein's downfall. To that point, Anna, you know the Republican Party. Well, it's one of the things that led to law enforcement investigation. But on the point that you made,
it was allegedly over a real estate deal that they got into a fight over.
But the email says
and
actually
they didn't just know each other. Let's just be truthful and transparent here. They didn't just know each other.
He's in a lot of
they were
pictures.
incredibly close friends.
He reported him to the police. That's what I'm saying. That is objective. That is objectively true.
It sounds like you believed that there would be men in the files who would be held accountable. Rightfully so. And the American people are with you on this. Why haven't we seen the release of over 2.5 million additional Epstein file documents. It seems like you are someone that is on the right side of history on this.
So we have released, I think it's 6 million files or 6 million pages of documents. My understanding is that 2.5 million, Sonny, I'm going to check on this to make sure, but my understanding is that a lot of those are duplicates of things that have already been released.
So we're not
holding anything back. Some of those things are like the courts have to order you to release them. So that was one thing that we confronted. You talk about these situation room meetings is, there was a big bunch of files that existed, I think in the Southern District of New York, or maybe it was some other jurisdiction, but we were like, we want to release these files, but you need the court approval in order to release the files. Sometimes we would apply to release the files and the courts would say no. So those particular documents, I would need to actually know exactly what you're talking about.
3.5 million documents were released, and my understanding is 2.5 million have not been released.
Those may have been the ones that are under court. So I don't know what the documents you're talking about, but I'm telling you,
Let me go to break. Let me go to break.
Sure.
Let me go to break. Because people are looking at me, going.
All right, so they say the stuff about the files that are left over that haven't been released yet, and I'll get to that in a second. But JD Vance starts by saying this thing about how they used to be friends, but then Trump reported him to the police, got him arrested. So he almost got away with saying Trump reported him to the police, and that's what led to his downfall. But really, this entire premise that Trump reported Epstein to the police is not true. Trump mentioned to, I think, a local sheriff in Palm Beach, that Epstein was a scumbag and a bad guy, and I'm glad you're looking into him, after the investigation was announced. So Trump did not report him to the police at all. If anything, he knew about this, he had information about Epstein, and did not say anything to the police until they already were investigating him publicly. But another aspect of that story is that Trump found out what he was doing and kicked him out of the club because he was scummy. That's actually not true. I think the FBI announced recently during Trump's term that based on the information they have, Trump did not kick Epstein out when he learned from one of the girls who brought it up the ladder what Epstein was doing. Trump learned about this and did not kick him out of the club. Now, it's possible that there were tensions between them during this time, and that fueled this idea that he was poaching girls from his club or making things more risky for him. But also, it's just as easy to speculate that they were in some kind of business arrangement together. But the idea that Trump found out Epstein was a bad guy and immediately went to the police, and then eventually that's what led to his downfall, that is a complete abject lie. And I think if you pull the thread on that lie, you get right back to the center of all of it, which is why Trump didn't want those files to be released in the first place. And the idea that they behind the scenes were working to get transparency for everybody, and the only holdup was like courts or something that weren't letting them release certain things, that's just bullshit. They were absolutely trying to figure out how to release stuff in a way that did not implicate Trump, because a lot of it did implicate Trump, and we still haven't gotten the worst of the things that are related to Trump himself. There's information coming out that the 13-year-old girl who very credibly accused Trump of rape, whose story seems to line up with reality, that she was viewed by the FBI to be a credible source. We didn't hear a lot about that. That was a few weeks after the Epstein stuff was really in the headlines. What's interesting is that he didn't go for the angle of, well, all the files that we haven't released, include bad things that can't be released, images and stuff that Epstein had, and that's mostly what the remaining files are. That's an excuse I've heard in the past. So if they ever have to come out again and say, well, we haven't released this such and such million documents because it's all really bad material, that's going to contradict what JD Vance just said here. So that'll be an interesting thing to keep an eye on. In this next part, they talk about immigration, and this is where they bring up this idea of being a Catholic, being religious, and still having this draconian approach to immigration. So here's that.
Over 50 people have died in ICE custody. There are thousands of children, 6,200, that are being held in places like Dilley Detention Center. The people that have visited those detention centers, I don't know if you have, talk about the subhuman, infrahuman conditions, the lack of clean water, the lack of medical attention, the lack of education. I would urge you as a Christian and as a father to visit those detention centers where the children are being held and make sure that the conditions are up to the values that we hold in this country.
We do have to strike a balance, of course, between enforcing our laws. We don't want to dehumanize people. That is the balance that, look, law enforcement, what I'd say about this, law enforcement is always inherently not a very pretty process, especially when you're dealing sometimes with violent people, with people who are resisting arrest. Some of the people that I've been told by the media were completely peaceful, had never violated any laws. You actually look into the record and you find out that those people were actually being violent, or they did have a criminal record. They had a sex trafficking conviction.
Don't have criminal records. So the majority of people that ICE is rounding up and taking out of their homes from their families, they're separating families. They're using children as bait.
But
the majority are not criminal.
But can I respond to that, guys? Let me just say this. Okay. So you talk about the children. Here's what I'd say. Do we know that during the last administration, we had tens of thousands of children who were sex trafficked by the cartels, who were brought into our country in profoundly dangerous and predatory conditions?
Let's talk about this administration.
But here's the point. Unless you enforce the border, you invite that kind of conduct. You think that our immigration policies are inhumane based on the reporting of one person with a political bias. What I'm telling you is that it's inhumane to allow cartels to sex traffic people across our border.
And by the way, hold on. Two things. You talk a lot about your Catholic faith, but the Catholic faith says we take in immigrants. We take in people who don't have or who are having a hard time. How do you justify both things?
So fundamentally, if you think about what is immigration enforcement, immigration is law enforcement. It's somebody who has broken a law enforcement officer has to show up and enforce that law. Now, inherently, sometimes that process is not always going to be pretty if you capture a video clip of it, in the same way that if you arrest somebody for committing a violent or a nonviolent crime, sometimes it's not always pretty. What I'm saying is the Catholic faith is actually I think it strikes the right balance here. It says, the Christian faith, I think this is true of Protestants and Catholics, that you can have borders.
Yeah.
You're allowed to enforce your borders. That means the law enforcement piece of it. But you also have to take
so this is one of the main points that you hear
care.
a lot when it comes to Trump, this idea that he shut down the border. And I want to examine this a little bit because it's commonly the thing that people credit Trump for. This is the one thing he's done well. And a lot of people now take it for granted that that's a good thing because immigration became an unavoidable subject during the 2024 election. Democrats didn't have a good answer for it. So now all we're left with is, well, you might as well just shut down the border. So again, what exactly does that mean? What it means is that Trump has militarized certain parts of the border and is using military to carry out arrests at the border and some technology as well. But also, mostly what he has done is shut down or tighten the legal pathways to entering. So he has cracked down on legal immigration more than he has cracked down on illegal immigration. This is an analysis that came out of the Cato Institute, which is a right-wing think tank, and has published one of the most scathing reports on Trump's immigration policy so far, and also making the case that, you see these zoomed out maps that show as soon as Trump took office, encounters at the border went down immediately, which we'll get back to in a second what that means. But really, similarly to inflation, that number was already coming down during the Biden administration while he was under pressure to tighten his policy at the border, which is what he did. The strongest point that Trump has to make is that it's a deterrent. The policy they have at the border is a deterrent, and that's why there is such a low number of encounters, which means people who were arrested or turned away, or people who attempted to do something like file for asylum and were rejected. So that's what an encounter means. It does not mean someone who entered the country illegally. We don't actually know the numbers of people who might be getting around the system. There's probably some. But really, it's similar to the fact that Trump is rounding up an enormous amount of people in the country who haven't committed violent crimes. A lot of the people who are being prevented or disincentivized from entering the country are the ones who would have been doing it the right way and would be contributing positively to the economy, but we are depriving ourselves of that through disincentive. So there's a larger question here of how that affects the economy and the broader question of immigration, which I do think is something that is under-addressed by Democrats, because they didn't have really a robust argument to make about amnesty or how to deal with a large portion of people that came over in the last few years. And ultimately, the pressures that push people to come to America and the incentives that American companies have to employ those people or to encourage lax but also dehumanizing immigration policy is going to make it so that people keep coming. And this Band-Aid tactic that Trump has taken, essentially all Republicans know how to do, clamp down on an issue, clamp down on enforcement, and push off the residual effects for later. I predict what will happen if they continue cutting into the labor pool in America by deporting good laborers, but also people that are employed for very low wages by American corporations, is that that's going to increase demand for labor and decrease the supply, which would normally force wages up. But because this is a pro-business administration, they are going to be under pressure to force wages down. And truthfully, the best tactic that Democrats could take on taking back control of that is pointing out that having an immigrant laborer have the same rights that you have and focusing on that in terms of your policy, people coming here to work and having leverage against the companies that they're working for, that increases the leverage of all workers. So Democrats should be the party not only of union labor in America, but also strengthening the leverage of that union labor by including the immigrant labor that already is a significant contributor to that labor force in America. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. I got a lot of thoughts on that right now. But I'll get to this last part where this is where Whoopi Goldberg calls him out about racism, the racism of the Trump administration. I don't think she does a great job here. Sonny, the other co-host, does a good job of picking it up and making a more specific point, a fine point. And I do think that there is a great point to be made here, but Whoopi Goldberg kind of dropped the ball on it a little bit, in my opinion. So here's that.
What did black people do to this administration that has allowed it to really stigmatize folks of color? The Emmett Till stuff coming down, or them doing all kinds of removal of information.
What exactly are you talking about, Whoopi? Because you just
I'm talking
I know
about
Emmett Till was
I can tell you all this. Yeah.
No, I want to know what she's.
You don't know what I'm talking
to your
about.
actual point.
So in a lot of the museums, there's so many. Where they're taking down the actual history that happened in this country. Slavery happened. All kinds of stuff happened.
Allegedly the administration is holding back the appointments of people based on skin color.
I'm talking about a host of things. I'm talking about black history getting erased from public spaces. Black voter districts are being dismantled. Black leaders are being sidelined from our ranks. Where do Americans of color fit in this vision? Because it doesn't seem like we fit.
I think, Sonny, my view.
And if I may, since October of last year, there's been something like 6,668 refugees allowed into the country. All but 3 were white South Africans.
So, first of all, I'm very skeptical of that number because we have a lot of different immigration pathways in the United States of America. You say that we're anti-minority or anti-black.
No, I didn't say that. I asked. See?
Well, okay, fine. Fair.
Don't start any stuff
all
with
right,
me,
okay,
man. Don't get me in trouble. Don't start no stuff with me. But
I misinterpreted your question, but let me answer your actual question there. What I'm saying, I think, okay, look at Washington, D.C. One of the most democratic and one of the blackest, by a share of population, blackest cities in the United States of America, has seen a radical decrease in violent crimes and sexual assaults and in murders. We have tried to take the crime issue seriously, in part because we believe everybody, whether you're black or white or rich or poor, deserves to live in a safe neighborhood.
Why does the crime? Where does the crime step in? This is not about crime. This is about
women lost their jobs.
Right. This is about human
Sonny,
rights.
What you're saying is we got to do more on the economy.
Black history has been erased from public
Black
spaces.
history is not erased from public
spaces. Yeah, so she's referring to the erasure of history from certain museums, essentially pressure that Trump is putting on museums, not only when it comes to things like DEI, but specifically cutting into programs aimed at black history, the history of American oppression of black people and slavery, etc. And so Whoopi does not do a good job of mentioning specific things. You could even say specific things Trump has said on Truth Social, talking about how he thinks it's appalling that we're focusing on slavery and stuff like that, which JD Vance would no doubt have a slick explanation for. And I've mentioned this before. It used to be pretty well culturally understood that Trump is racist and, kind of has racist motivations and says racist things. But Nowadays, that's not so much the narrative anymore. And many people still recognize Trump as a bad guy or, right wing, but you have less of this standard understanding that Trump is racist. There's more support for Trump among the black community, as well as people willing to casually write off the racist things he says and the signs of racism that come from him. So it's not enough anymore to just say, why doesn't this administration like black people? You have to be able to say what you mean, because the Trump administration isn't focused on that specifically. It's easier to make the case that his policy on immigration is racialized, or this point that she makes about how the only refugees that got in are white South Africans. JD Vance says he doesn't like that number, but it's true. That's a perfect example of how they've tightened the nozzle of people coming in through legal means. And, the attacks on DEI, as well as purposely cutting into education on slavery and racism, etc. These are things that Trump has specifically made a case for, and the Republican Party has specifically made a case for. And until the media, the sort of liberal media like this, can recognize that that is a partisan issue, and that the fact that the racism of Donald Trump is so normalized is as a consequence of the fact that the country has moved to the right. And yes, the racism itself is becoming more normalized, which is its own problem, but also the economic policy, the immigration policy, and the overall narrative that is being delivered about America, which is a little bit what they're gesturing to here. That is what has made it so that people culturally don't have the same understanding of what racism is coming from the president anymore. And that can only be fixed with a left-wing focus on economic and social policy, in my opinion.